Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Making Planning Free and Productive for Your Nonprofit, 5 Action Steps to Effective Nonprofit Strategic Planning. My name is Zach Shalafor, a Senior Manager with James Moore & Company, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items to go over. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we will be saving time at the end of the presentation to answer as many of those as we can. On the GoToWebinar interface on your screen, there is a section to input any questions that you may have. If you run into any technology issues with the software accessing the webinar or any audio or visual issues, there's an 800 number for GoToWebinar that you can call for assistance with any issues. And if you are listening to this webinar and plan to obtain CPE credit, this is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credits, and we will be contacting everyone after the presentation to follow up with additional details. Again, my name is Zach Shalafor. I am a Senior Manager with James Moore & Company. I've been with the firm for approximately 8 years and work very extensively, almost exclusively, with nonprofit and governmental entities. I am joined today by 2 individuals. The first is a colleague at James Moore & Company. James Halloran is a partner with James Moore, and he has been with the firm for over 20 years. He also specializes in nonprofit and governmental agencies, and James is the leader of the SNAP program, the Strategic Nonprofit Alliance Partnership, which was created in the Daytona area in response to the needs and to try and address some of the needs and serve nonprofits in an additional manner beyond just some of your traditional services. He also serves currently as the treasurer for the United Way of Volusia and Flagler counties, and he will be the incoming president this summer. We are also joined today by Hardy Smith, the nonprofit guru, as we like to call him. Hardy has decades of experience working with NASCAR and in the automotive industry, and he has taken that experience and those business models that he's learned and worked with and formulated those to apply to nonprofits, to help nonprofits just improve in all sorts of different areas. Some of Hardy's professional affiliations include the Center for Association Leadership, the Florida Society of Association Executives, the National Speakers Association, Board Source, and the Association of Fundraising Professionals. Hardy, James, how are you guys doing today?
We are doing great. Thanks for the introduction, Zach.
Great. Good afternoon, Zach. Look forward to the program.
All right. Well, let's get into our topic for the day. We all know that we're here to talk about planning, but when we talk about planning, it's a very vague word. It can be applied in all sorts of different areas. So, James, do you want to go through just some of the areas that we'll be looking at today when we talk about planning?
Yeah, planning could be a multi-year plan, such as a strategic plan or a multi-year budget program or capital development facilities plan. It could also be a short time frame for when you're planning for an item. It could be your monthly closing financial statements, how you close your books each month, present reports back to your finance or your management side. You also have compliance planning for grants, especially now with the new uniform guidance requirements for federal audits coming in this next year. And like we mentioned before, capital projects and facilities always need some planning done there. You also have plans to reduce costs and improve efficiencies. All those processes, planning to how you're going to be able to accomplish that and streamline your operations. You also have the initial assessment of a not-for-profit, especially when you're bringing on a new client, whether that client is a child or an adult with a disability or some other area that you're responding back to in the not-for-profit community. From a pure accounting standpoint, of course, you have plans in place related to your accounting processes, payroll, purchasing, those items. Another thing would be conversion to a paperless software. Many of us are in that process right now of converting over to paperless environment. So those are some big things that are occurring. And then, of course, there's budgeting.
All right, thanks, James. And Hardy, I know strategic planning is one area that's right up your alley. So along with that, what are some other types of planning that you see as key areas to really focus on?
Zach, some other types of planning activity that I'm especially looking forward to sharing concepts that will help on the program today are those especially related to fundraising, signature events, special events, and a couple of other areas are staff development planning and planning for future leadership or succession planning within an organization.
All right, thank you. So now that we have a general overview of the types of planning that we're going to be looking at, as we come to this next slide, of course, the last thing that you want to do is go down like the Titanic. So James, on some of the areas that you talked about, what could happen or some of the ramifications be if you don't plan?
Well, in relation to compliance planning, which is really your grants or any of your donors that have restrictions on how your funds could be utilized, there's always a risk there. And one example I'll go through here is a new grant was obtained by an organization, and they didn't do well at planning that process of reporting back to that grantor. The grantors these days want information, they want to see the outcomes, they want to see the results, and they want that information timely. So the funding agency, as these reports started coming in late, the funding agency became more and more concerned, eventually went in and performed additional monitoring, which then took away staff time. You know, staff was already behind in getting reports to them. Then they had to deal with the monitors coming in, which in effect, led to less services being able to provide to their customers or clients, as well as overtime hours incurred by the entity and additional payroll costs that typically would not have been incurred. Another example is switching to a paperless client billing system. This is going to be a major change for any organization, and over the years we've seen a couple examples where this didn't really go as planned because not everything was thought out ahead of time. It could be as easy on the front end as not really thinking through all the costs that are involved in implementing a paperless system. There are costs involved not only in the hardware and the software, you also got to think about training. You'll pay training dollars to get familiar with the software, but there's the internal training time. What typically might have taken someone 30 minutes to do in the beginning is going to take them a little bit longer to get used to that. And while they're training on the software, they're not able to produce as much workload as they were before, so you need to budget that in, that additional payroll. You may have some overtime hours involved in that process. But ultimately, what could happen is the reporting agencies, the grantors, when they receive that information late, it's going to add time and cost into your budget process that you didn't already expect. Monthly financial reports is another area. If you cannot produce those financial reports on a timely basis and have that information available for management to make decisions or your finance committee to see those, you want to have those there so they can adjust the direction of the organization.
James, from my experience, I'm seeing that compliance is getting to be a huge red flag in the world of nonprofit organizations from a regulatory standpoint and also from a funder standpoint, and that word sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, unfortunately in today's world, the compliance goes along with transparency. You hear that buzzword all the time where, the days are gone where you can kind of do something and ask for forgiveness later because we're a not-for-profit and we're doing good out in the community. That used to be what not-for-profits could get away with at times. Now they're like, we have all the information available. It's all on the web. We've provided you training. They don't have the good hearts, you say, as people have in the not-for-profit world, hasn't crossed over onto the funding side as well.
And we see all the time examples, unfortunately, of nonprofits who, because of unintended consequences by people who were just trying to do good, they do get into compliance trouble.
Yeah, the interesting, the buzzword you also hear is outcome. People want to see, the funders want to see, the donors want to see outcome-based measurements. You said you were going to serve this many people. How can you prove that you've served? How can you prove that you've improved the education level of individuals? At United Way, we're looking at health and income and education, and we're driving our model based off outcome measures to improve those outcome measurements.
I think that's definitely, we've seen that just all along with all the new grant changes where compliance becomes more and more critical. In some of the big pictures area, Hardy, strategic planning and those sorts of areas, what types of concerns do you see or potential issues if you don't plan appropriately?
Well, that's a great question. Going back to my NASCAR racing days, one of the lessons, and people ask me all the time, Hardy, you work for Bill France. What's the best lesson you ever got from Bill France? That's easy. It's, Hardy, solve your problems in advance. And in the world of nonprofits, a good, solid planning process will help you solve your problems in advance. So whether it's your fundraising is coming up short, you're not recruiting enough volunteers, or you're having succession issues, or you're having staff issues, the list of problems are unlimited, but a good planning process will help you identify those problems and identify workable solutions so that you're moving the organization down the road in a positive direction. And another thing you miss out on by not incorporating good planning into your activities is you miss out on the benefits. And one of those benefits that does help increase organizational capacity, increases your fundraising efforts, and increases and generates improvement in the organization all across the board, is that of creativity. So just being able to incorporate a good planning process, for example, into your signature event activity. You could have been running an event for a couple of decades, and it's getting a little stale, and it would benefit from creative thought. But if you'll take some time to plan the signature event, that allows for your planning team, your signature event team, to be creative in their thinking.
All right, I think, Hardy, with those comments regarding fundraising, signature events, you really lead in perfectly to one of the next questions I had, where when we first talked a couple of weeks ago, you gave us a stat that I found to just be pretty surprising related to fundraising and the fact that 25% of organizations do not plan for their fundraisers. And given how, in many cases, these can be the bread and butter for some organizations, that just seemed like an exceptionally high number when you would almost expect it to be 100%.
Isn't that just a real head scratcher? The money is the lifeblood of all nonprofit organizations. You've got to have the cash to be able to do the good that you want to do. But the research, recently released research from the Haas Compass Point study, says 25% of nonprofits across the country don't make time for planning their fundraising activities. So that gets me to the next point that I wanted to make sure I emphasize today, is that my research shows that if you're not willing to take time to plan for your fundraising that you've got to have, how likely is it that you're going to make time to plan for succession planning or operational type functions? The answer is probably not so much.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, Hardy. As we move to our next slide, I look at this, initially, and I just see a tasty apple pie. How about you, James?
Yeah, I'm thinking that needs some, ice cream on it with some whipped cream.
Yeah, that definitely sounds pretty good. But Hardy, from what I understand, though, there is a little more to this concept and to this picture than just a tasty piece of pie, right?
Well, I like the heading here because it's so accurate. Pie is a process, not a dessert. Now, let me explain. One of the reasons why past planning hasn't worked is the experience has been a negative one, and it doesn't produce the results that the organization would have liked to have had. The reason the results don't happen is because the organization isn't getting enough pie. Now, the 3 essential ingredients to a great tasting pie recipe from a planning perspective are planning, implementation, and evaluation. And I know we're going to discuss those right now. We'll help make a great planning pie.
All right, well, I was hoping you were going to say that the first ingredient would be a lot of sugar, but I guess we can go with planning. So the first section, as Hardy said, the first section of the pie concept is planning. Before we discuss planning any further, though, we do have our first polling question of the day. So for everybody listening, what are some challenges that influence not planning that you have encountered? We will give everybody a few moments just to select an answer and submit, and then we'll get those results tallied and go from there.
These are some great questions, Zach. I'm glad you came up with these. It'll be interesting to see what the responses are.
It looks like there's definitely some strong favorites of way people were thinking the reason is.
All right, the results are in. So 12% said that we always plan. That's great, but we'll come back to you on the next question. Otherwise, the most prominent answer with 54% is the lack of time. And James, I think this is probably something that was not totally unexpected when we talk about reasons sometimes that planning is not properly done.
Yeah, lack of time and financial constraints is what we hear a lot of, which are kind of interrelated when you think about it. You know, people say, well, I don't have the time to plan, but sometimes you're spending more hours performing a process or a task, and you could actually reduce the time if you spent some time planning up front. So I'll give you an example that we worked with a client on where during the economic recession, like many other not-for-profits, they saw their contributions decline significantly, close to 30% reduction in what their annual giving was by their top donors, and other donors. Their special events were down as well. Sponsorships were declining on those special events. Either some companies eliminated them altogether or went from a $5,000 sponsorship down to a $1,000 sponsorship. So as we were seeing these, you know, the management of that not-for-profit said, hey, we got an issue here. We need to have a tighter control on our financials than we've ever had in the past. We need to know better on a day-to-day or quicker basis after month end, where are we at financially? You know, do we have enough cash in reserves? Are we good from a working capital standpoint? So what the management department did is they got with accounting, and typically accounting was providing them financial statements anywhere from 60 to 90 days after the end of a month. So they wouldn't know their December results until typically around March. So that was not going to work in that recession time period. So we started discussing with them, you know, what things could change. So we went in and performed an operational efficiency analysis, which our firm uses principles of Lean Six Sigma to accomplish that, and really dissected and analyzed their whole process from start to finish at month end and all the different people involved, and looked at that and said, where can we save some time? Where can things be reordered? Are there different people in the organization who could potentially help at that crunch time at the end of a month to facilitate and speed up that process? And the results was they went from a monthly closing time frame of 60 to 90 days down to 7 to 14 days. So significant improvement there. Basically within a week or two after they're at month end, they have good financials that management, their finance committee can use. This is definitely wound up being a competitive advantage for them over their competitors. As we all know, every not-for-profit competes with the other ones in their community for those top donors and those top dollars. People argue about time and money, as I mentioned before, and if you're spending, you know, if you think you don't have time to plan, then you're actually already spending it because you haven't gotten as efficient potentially as you could be in some of your processes. In other organizations, there were frustrations. We've had just a minor thing with evaluations done, evaluations of personnel, how long that was taken to accomplish to get back to those, so especially to new people on the program side so they can see where they need their improvement done. Those program people are the heart. They're the ones dealing with your clients, whether it's a client with a disability or you're dealing with drug and alcohol rehabilitation, all those different areas. If you can speed up that process of orientating and educating your employees, that's going to make things better for your end clients. So we worked with that HR department to reduce turnaround time in half from what they're previously using. That was done primarily through existing technologies and softwares they already had on site. It didn't cost any money outside. It's just utilizing stuff they already had in their organization. Just from a perspective from a service industry, I'm in the service industry, being a CPA, accounting, auditing, consulting. Our rule of thumb is for every hour we spend on planning, we can reduce 2 hours later in our process. It's the old adage of sharpening your axe. You have two people, one's a great lumberjack, but he didn't sharpen his axe. You take someone who is not so good of a lumberjack like myself, and I sharpen my axe, I most times will beat that lumberjack.
And James, I'm going to kind of jump on the time argument here, or the time reason for not planning, and I'm really gonna challenge our nonprofit leaders here on the program today. This is a topic that I write a good bit about in my newsletters. I speak about this when working with organizations on planning. But if you stop and think about it from a time standpoint, I'm gonna challenge you. I'm gonna challenge our audience to think, look, my experience tells me that time is the number one reason that's given. I don't accept that it's the number one legitimate reason you don't plan. And I'm going to share some of the more legitimate reasons of why planning doesn't happen. But from a planning standpoint, if you would, stop and think about this, please. You're in an organization who wants to do good. You have a very compelling mission statement, like all organizations has. So you're wanting to affect change. You're wanting good things to happen. You've got people or causes that you're wanting to make a difference for. But yet, you don't have time to be better. You don't have time to do more good, which is the main benefit of a good planning process. A good planning process will enable you to serve more people. It will enable you to raise more money. It will enable you to be operationally more efficient and effective, grow capacity, and every other positive thing that you can possibly think of in the world of nonprofits. So from a time standpoint, I think that's really easy to kind of blame time, but there are other issues that really come to the forefront of why planning doesn't happen.
Yeah, and before we go to those other areas, I think I just have to come back to James's point on the for every 1 hour you spend planning, you save 2 hours on the back end. I feel like this can be challenging at times to go through that extra hour, because until you've gone through the end product, you don't actually see those savings, so you're having to invest that extra hour and then basically just go out and say, we expect that we're going to have these rewards as a result of this additional spend, as a result of the additional time that we're spending now. But on the other areas, Hardy, we did have a number of people that talked about the lack of participation in planning. As well as you had commented before about how sometimes planning just hasn't worked in the past.
Zach, and the folks that have indicated that a lack of participation, I can feel your pain. And here's some answers that will, and solutions that will help. Number one, be sure to take advantage of the resource that we're going to be offering you as a participant on today's webinar. We'll have a free handout, how to make planning pain-free and productive, and it will be a process. Part of that handout will give you a step-by-step engagement direction for improving your planning. A lack of participation, a lot of times people won't participate. The people who you should have on your planning team won't participate because past experience shows the plan either doesn't work, their ideas weren't accepted, or the whole thing was just a negative situation. So you've got to recruit. You've got to identify the people that are essential for your planning process, and you've got to make it a personal ask. You've got to go out and recruit the people that will make up the right membership of your planning process. And think about this. And this is for those in the audience today who are on social media and social sharing. This is certainly postable and tweetable. Use planning as an engagement tool. Use the planning process to get people involved. And that's going to have a tremendous benefit that we'll be sharing here just in a few moments on the webinar.
All right, as you talk about getting people involved, I think that's definitely, like you said, a key area as we get to the second ingredient in the pie. We have the sugar. This one's not apples, but it's implementing. So first we have the actual planning, and then we get into the implementation of that plan. Before we go into some of the areas and challenges there, we are going to go to our next polling question. So this is for that 12% who said that you always plan. the question is, for those who have created a plan, what challenges have you faced in actually going about implementing that plan? We'll give everybody a moment to select their answers.
Wow, look at those numbers coming in. That's really interesting, right?
All right, so our most popular answer, the lack of follow-through. All other areas very closely aligned. I know, James, when we talked a little bit earlier, you had really kind of been focusing on the two areas related to the implementation team and then just the buy-in to the entire process.
Yeah, not having the right implementation team is definitely an issue that people have, because many times your planning team is not the same as your implementation team. Your implementation team involves most times many more people inside the organization. It could involve from an IT side and maybe your HR side from an issue that really the planning side wasn't there. But those are really the nuts and bolts people. But in addition to that, when you talk about buy-in and support, you need to make sure that when you're trying to implement a plan or a process, if you want to come to that granular level, is to say, is there a cheerleader? Do you have management on board? Is top management on board with this plan? But on that team, you also need to have some people who actually do the physical work. So you need to have all those people playing together on the same team. The important thing is to have that team to have the authority to implement that team. Give them the management gives that team the ability to make the changes necessary for that plan. One example I have is improving communications between the program side of an entity and inside of a not-for-profit and the administrative accounting department, whether it's for grant disbursements, compliance, cash disbursements. And one scenario that we helped develop with a client was put the two sides together, because a lot of times accounting's coming at it from the pure grant compliance side, saying we need these things in this particular fashion or form in order to get reimbursed from our grantor. The program side is trying to deal with the individual clients, and they're focusing on the client side, which is where we want them to focus. By putting the people together who deal with that issue, having them talk through, what they were able to do is find they have a lot of commonalities. They both really want the same thing. So by having everyone at the table at the same time, they developed a better process that worked for both sides and sped up that process as well.
Thanks, James. And Hardy, going back to the polling question, the number one answer there, which over half of our listeners said was their primary issue when it comes to implementing the plan, the lack of follow-through. What do you think about that, and how do you really improve that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting number, and of course all of these responses relate to each other. But the 52% who are experiencing a lack of follow-through, I'm going to suggest that the 16% of responses on lack of buy-in and support is one of the underlying reasons why the follow-through doesn't happen. So getting the buy-in that James is talking about is so important for follow-up. And let me explain some examples of what happens. It's really easy for that nonprofit professional to say, you know what, this whole planning thing, I know we need a plan. It's hard to get my board together. They won't take time for a weekend retreat. They don't want to talk about planning. And staff doesn't want to work overtime. It's hard to get all of my staff members together, and they're already overworked anyway. So I'll just write the plan myself. Now, just without asking a poll, so if you're in the audience today, if you're one of those write the plan yourself people, raise your hand and maybe look at yourself in the mirror. That may be one of the reasons why you have a lack of follow-up. Because as an individual who writes the plan themselves, think about whose plan is it? And it's not your board's plan. It's not your staff's plan. It's not your stakeholders' plan. And just presenting a plan in a meeting and saying, here's our plan, what does everyone think? That is not buy-in. Buy-in is involvement from the very beginning, just like James talked about. So buy-in is gained from planning the planning process, being engaged in the planning process, again, from the very beginning, not just giving a rubber stamp okay at the end. Now, when it's not my plan, I'm also not committing to implement it. Oh, sure, as a board member, I voted to adopt the plan, but that doesn't mean just because I voted to adopt the plan, or I'm in a staff meeting and you told me as my supervisor or as my executive director that here's the plan that I'm going to be implementing, that doesn't mean I'm committed to it. So in my heart and in my mind, how hard am I really going to work? And experience shows not very hard. So one of the things that's so important is that when you're recruiting your implementation team, just like James talked about, could be the planning team could be totally different from your implementation team. So on implementation task, instead of a task assignment that's telling someone what they're expected to do, consider asking them. Now, would you think there's a world of difference between asking and telling? Because again, asking could be the due diligence on your part as an organization leader, asking to see if the individual being tasked is capable of getting the job done. Maybe they don't have time. Maybe for whatever the reason is, they can't get the job done. So if you force that task on them anyway, then you know you're set up for failure. Don't assume. Another key mistake in the area of buy-in, don't assume that writing names next to a task item means that someone is going to follow up and get the job done. In the world of volunteering 101, one of the cardinal mistakes is when you're working with volunteers, and this would apply to staff, your staff employees also, don't delegate and forget. So don't assume that you can delegate a task related to a planning activity, regardless of the type of plan it is. Don't assume you can delegate and forget it and just figure it's going to be done, because in most cases it doesn't. So that's why the plans don't get implemented and sit on a shelf.
All right. Well, you talk about sitting on a shelf. That definitely leads us into the next area. But one thing, just as I think about what you guys have said, as we talk about implementing the plan and really having that follow through and buy-in, kind of the term I look at myself is just having a vested interest. Where I think, Hardy, what you're kind of saying is you want to make sure all of your employees, they feel that they have that vested interest. And like you said, you're not just doing something because you're told to, but you understand it and you're really more or less a part of it.
Absolutely right. Major, major difference.
All right. Well, again, going back to leaving something on a shelf, the third step in the process and the pie is the evaluation. So first we plan, then we implement, and then we have to evaluate. I think the best example here is your strategic plan. If you leave it on the shelf collecting dust for years and years, you're probably not evaluating it. Before we go into some of these specific areas related to the evaluation, we have our next polling question. And very straightforward, this is just, does your plan have measurable goals that you use to evaluate how well you've done it?
And that can apply to any type plan, right? It could be a fundraising plan, a strategic plan, any type. Do you incorporate measurable goals into your planning activity?
Yeah, for sure, Hardy. So looking at the results, I think we've got a pretty solid group on our hands here, Hardy. We have 91% said that yes, their plans do have measurable goals. So for the other 9%, or just in general, some best practices, Hardy. What are your thoughts as far as some of the key areas that you want to focus on having those measurable goals?
Well, I'd like to first send a virtual high five to the 91% that are incorporating measurable goals into their planning activity. So congratulations to you. To our other 99%, here's some things that'll help you. If you will consider whether it's dollars being raised, volunteers being recruited, deadlines to be met, how much improvement you're trying to achieve with this particular plan, put a number to it. Put a number to it. Then you hold yourself accountable. You're able to measure and evaluate to see what kind of progress you're either making or what type of adjustments that need to happen.
All right, and James, on the financial side, what types of measurable goals and targets do you see as being key areas to incorporate into planning?
Well, as I was discussing before with that financial monthly closing process of my client, where they recognize, hey, it's taken us 3 months sometimes to get our financial statements so management and the board can make decisions. They consciously set a goal. They wanted to only actually get to a month. They thought going from 60 to 90 days to 30 days would be great, and they actually were able to reduce it further. So, and you can see that a lot of times with financial goals, it's easier to measure it. But there are lots of ways. Say like on intake, if you have a type of operation, a not-for-profit, where you're seeing so many clients a day or having to do initial assessments of clients, evaluating that to see and measuring it to say, okay, typically we take in 10 clients in a 4-hour period, is figuring out a way where they'll be able to reduce that time frame to be able to assess more clients and assist more people in the community. An easy part from a measurable side, of course, is budgeting. People budget both their expenses and their revenues. I usually see more focus on the expense side. People get a little hung up on their expenses, which is needed to keep those in line. But the problem that I typically see is the revenue side sometimes is forgotten. That people forget that in order their budget when they originally came up with it was sometimes to break even, or a lot of times you want to make a profit so you can reinvest it back in your not-for-profit, whether that's reinvesting back in your personnel through increased training or just your infrastructure inside of your not-for-profit, whether you have buildings or equipment or anything like that. If you don't have the revenues coming in, you won't succeed. So what I find a lot of times on the revenue side is not paying attention to the contribution revenue or the grant revenue. It's like, oh, well, we lost this grant from this agency, then no one's taken that into consideration and saying, okay, do we need to change our plan now? Do we need to change how we're operating because we don't have this revenue source coming in? The example I'll use from my United Way board side is we have an annual campaign. At every meeting, we're discussing where's our campaign this year, where is it out from last year, where are we at with our major campaigns on employers, who's already in, who's not in, are they up, are they down? So that's a major focus at every one of our meetings is where we're at on campaign and then on collecting those pledges.
Thanks, James.
Another thought on evaluation. You can use planning as an engagement tool, and that certainly applies to the evaluation aspects. My research to answer the question, why don't board members do what they're supposed to do? One of the leading complaints by board members that I've surveyed says that they feel underutilized and in their board duties. So you can use your planning document, the evaluation part of the planning document, to create a living process that doesn't just sit on the shelf. Consider this from a board perspective. For each one of your planning priorities, schedule one of those priorities as a discussion item at board meetings, and you can that will help evaluate your status reports.
All right, thanks, Harding. As you talk about leaving something on the shelf, I think that kind of leads us into our next area and our next polling question. So for everyone listening, do you schedule time to review or evaluate your plan, or is it just something that happens every once in a while that you decide to take that strategic plan off the shelf, dust it off, and see what was written a couple of years back? So our results very much right down the middle there. We have a little bit more, yes, but pretty much we're just about 50-50 in terms of how many of our listeners formally schedule and plan on a time to review and evaluate the implementation of the plan. Hardy, are those numbers about what you expected, or higher, lower?
That's somewhat surprising. So I think it's kind of interesting. I wasn't really sure what to expect with this particular question, but it is really interesting. Again, congratulations and a virtual high five to the 53% that does schedule evaluations, and then to the 47%, can't urge you strongly enough to schedule that time. And again, repeating, it could happen in a board meeting, evaluation could happen in segments, in a staff meeting also.
All right, and James, what do you see as some of the challenges or barriers to being able to formally go in and schedule that time, or other challenges?
Well, it's the same excuse we had right in the beginning. People say, well, I don't have time now. I've got a process. It's working. Why should I go back and rethink this process? I already did that 2 years ago, 5 years ago, sometimes 10 years ago. But as everyone kind of knows, things change rapidly in today's age. So you got to constantly be thinking about, is there a way to change what I'm doing and make that a better process? Just like in the case I talked about in financial reporting on a monthly basis, going back and discussing not only with the accounting department but with your finance committee, management, program side, and asking them, okay, is this information, one, what you wanted, and two, is it as timely as you wanted it? And over time, getting with them and finding out, is there some other metric that program side really would like to see potentially? Is there a metric that the finance committee, maybe on the finance committee side, they'd want to see maybe days cash on hand, or they'd want to see from an overall perspective for the board, well, what's our percentage of program cost to total cost of the organization? Are we at 20%? Are we at 15%? Are we at 30%? Because I'm getting asked by other people in the community when I talk to, about how much we're actually giving back, for program services. You could have grant processes that may need to be reevaluated. Upcoming here in the next year, most of my organizations that receive federal grants are being forced to reevaluate their process, and I encourage them to kind of take it right from the beginning and reevaluate the entire process with the new uniform grant requirements coming in. It's a great time to look at some grant compliance procedures people have had and redesign those and see if there's some efficiencies that can be gained.
And one of the things, Zach, I would encourage our audience to not settle for anything less during an evaluation review process. Don't settle for anything less than definite answers, specific answers. I'm always reminded about, as a parent, about when our son was come at the end of the day after elementary school, and I asked, well, how was your day today? And the answer invariably, fine, and that's it. So if I didn't go deeper, that's all I got, which didn't tell me anything. So if you're talking about dollars raised, how many dollars are raised? Not, we're on target, things seem to be going well. You need specifics for whatever measurable you have. You get definite answers.
Definitely. And I think one of the key words James mentioned a few times just a moment ago was, we talked about review and evaluation. James used the word reevaluation. And that really leads us into the third and final area of evaluating, which we will now go to our next polling question, is do you modify your plan as needed to continuously improve it? So basically here it is, okay, you evaluate it, but do you just evaluate and stop, or do you evaluate and then continue to try and further grow and improve that plan? So a little jump in the numbers here, about 71% said that yes, they do continue to improve and reassess the plan. Definitely a pretty strong trend. Hardy, what do you think?
Well, some, again, good numbers there. That's very good for that 71%. For the 29%, just a word that might help you. This webinar today is originating from Daytona Beach. We're literally across the street from Daytona International Speedway, the home of the Daytona 500. All day long, NASCAR superstars are racing around a 2.5-mile speedway to get to the finish line just as fast as they can. But periodically, during the course of a 500-mile race, they're stopping for pit stops. Why? Because they're evaluating their engine performance, they're evaluating their fuel performance, the mileage, they're evaluating wear and tear on the tires, they're reevaluating strategy with the driver, and all of those kind of things happen, then boom, they're out of the pits and back on the track again. So during that course of that 500-mile race, they are taking time to evaluate.
All right, I think another great example of that as you talk about the Speedway, since we're right here in Daytona, is they recently, not too long ago, completed close to, I think, about a $500 million renovation of the Speedway and various other improvements. just conceptually focused on what the consumer demands are and how to best meet that. A different set of financial resources than many of the organizations that we're talking with and work with on a daily basis. But conceptually, I think it very much applies where it's just staying alert and always being ready to adapt to whatever the circumstances are that face your organization. James, how about on the financial side?
Well, as we mentioned, today things are changing faster than ever before compared to previous years. We also find when you reevaluate continuously, which is a part of Lean Six Sigma as well, sometimes these small changes are a lot easier for organizations to adapt to, that if you wait too long, you have to do a drastic change to your entire process. Where if you do small changes each year or every couple of months, depending on what you're looking at, it's a lot less disruptive to your organization. Those small steps, say for the budget example, if management or the finance committee can see those and then can react immediately to a situation, it can definitely help from a cash flow perspective. They can make some cuts in costs. They can change an approach maybe they're taking on a revenue side, or emphasize more of their efforts and more of their time in fundraising potentially if that's where they're seeing some downfalls. Example, just something today, we were talking about our webinar for today, we knew we had potential for bad weather, so making sure we had battery backups in place, reevaluating the process we do every time we do our webinars, little things like that in any type of plan that you may have for your organization.
Certainly, and as we go through this last piece of the model, Hardy, I did want to just come back to the pie model as a whole. And we talked about those three areas, and in those three areas, you really had 5 key takeaways or focuses that came out of that. So would you like to just take us quickly through those key points, the most important piece of the pie, so to speak?
Well, looking at the 5 points, Zach, number 1, of course, avoiding mistakes. Well, the mistakes of not planning, that's the biggest mistake. And then use planning as a tool for engagement. We talked about that, how to use planning to help create a positive planning process and get that desired outcomes. James talked really well about addressing the need to develop a good planning team. Implementing the plan doesn't do any good if it's sitting on the shelf. So you've got to have the implementation element in there, and the E slice of the pie, evaluate and adjust, is needed.
All right, thanks, Hardy. As we go through that, we do have a couple of questions that came in. We will get to those right now. And again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to submit them as we go on these first couple that we do have. If there are any questions that come in that we do not have a chance to address in today's session, we will definitely make sure to follow up with you after the presentation is over. So the first question relates to having special events and really the best way to go about that. James, do you have a couple suggestions as far as any best practices or ideas for running a successful special event?
Yeah, from the accounting side, what we see a lot of times on our special event is people are very good. Take an example, a golf tournament. People are very good about planning, okay, we have this many sponsors, we know our revenue, we know how many golfers, what our max amount of golfers potentially could be for the course. So then from that, you can get with the golf course and figure out, pretty much what your cost is going to be, or the check you're going to have that's going to leave the organization. The part that's many times forgotten is the impact back on the organization's staff, or volunteer time as well, is how many volunteers are needed for this? How is that going to be coordinated? Are you having other volunteers coordinate the volunteers, or is that being borne back by the program or administrative side? And a lot of times people forget those costs that are involved. And in some situations, when people went through that process and documented the hours that their staff was spending on a particular special event, they realized in some cases they weren't even making money, and that's even before an overhead allocation potentially. So really looking at those special events to say, if it's purely a fundraising event, if the goal is to bring dollars into your organization, are you really bringing dollars in if your staff has spent 40, 60, 100 hours to plan this event, and that time could have been spent somewhere else for your organization?
All right, thanks, James. Hardy, let's go with you to you on this one. One of the next questions, we talked about having the right people on board as you go through the planning process. Really, how do you start that, and who are the best people to make sure that you involve?
Well, the first thing to think about is, what are you trying to accomplish with your particular plan? So if it's a fundraising activity, who are the fundraisers that you can incorporate into your event? There are a lot of charity golf tournaments. I know in my experience, my golfing effort is pretty much a humorous situation. So I'm not the guy to be involved in planning a golf tournament. Go get golfers. If you're having a walk or a running event, go get runners, because those are going to be your customers too. So get that mindset. You may need strategic people. If your organization is considering a merger, and there's a lot of that type of activity, you may need strategic type thinking. You may need a financial consideration and that mindset being included. A lot of organizations, I met with an organization recently, and they're undergoing an entire retooling of all the back of the house technical work, from their telephone systems to their computer systems, data bases, and that's a massive technical undertaking. Well, I may be good at raising money for nonprofits, or may even be good at strategic planning. I really don't know anything about the IT world and computers, so wouldn't it be a good idea to have some of those folks with that experience on a planning team, involving a whole new changeover with your technical capabilities? Two others, by all means, regardless of the planning activity, get your creative people, get your visioning people, people who can see the big picture and help you put that Disney imagination type activity on it. That's the kind of team that I would want to try to recruit.
Gotcha. One other question that we did have talks really about change. We of course know the old adage that people generally do not like change, but we did have one question talking about, what if you're properly going through this process, adapting and trying to change a plan as you go along, but you're getting resistance from people that they don't like that change. How do you go about handling that and really kind of getting people to embrace that change, Hardy?
Well, as humans, it's one of the tendencies that we all share to some degree, Zach, and we are kind of resistant to change. We just don't like new. So in your planning process, remember this. Charles Darwin didn't say it's the strongest of the species that survives. He didn't say it's the most intelligent of the species that survives. What Darwin said was, the species that survives is the one most able to adapt. So when you're thinking about change affecting your nonprofit organization, just consider all the change and challenge that's affecting nonprofits across the country today. And two of those, number one, there is not enough money, and number two, the demand is out of the roof for just about everyone. So you can't continue to do things the way you've always done them and expect to get a different result. Everyone's heard that before. So follow Darwin and understand that to survive, you've got to adapt. So if it is a challenge, understand this. There's a great book that I advocate to all of my nonprofit clients to read by Chip and Dan Heath. The name of the book is Switch, S-W-I-T-C-H. And the bottom line premise is, make change when change is hard to do in small incremental steps. So consider a planning process that's going to affect change. Make that change occur over a period of time and in small steps. That'll help.
All right, thanks, Harry. And then, one or two thoughts. Any quick tips on how to get people engaged in the planning process?
Another quick tip would be use or consider a planning process that works for you, your organization, and the personalities of the individuals who would be involved in the planning process.
All right, well, thank you. That's all the questions that we have. We do want to just go through a couple more items. James, with you first, you talked about some of the non-traditional services that James Moore provides. It's not just your stereotypical tax audit and that's about it services. What else is there out there that James Moore offers that some of our listeners might not be aware of?
Well, one of them you're hearing today, our commitment to the not-for-profit community through our creation of the Strategic Nonprofit Alliance Partnership. And we offer webinars as well as on-site training, live training throughout our 3 offices in Daytona Beach, Gainesville, and Tallahassee. We have various speakers come in, like Hardy Smith, or coming up next week in our Daytona office, we have a speaker from Brown & Brown discussing insurance needs and evaluating your insurance. Our firm also provides services from a technology standpoint, from IT, whether that is helping manage your network, or in some cases we have clients have very sophisticated network systems. They have a great network engineer on staff. But they just need sometimes for someone to bounce ideas off of and get some different perspective. We also can outsource your accounting services as opposed to you guys having to hire your own accounting staff. We can take that on for clients, and we do that from very small not-for-profits up to very large. We have some large foster care and adoption agencies, as well as some workforce development boards, so the whole gamut of grant compliance we can handle inside our firm. Operational efficiency is one thing I've talked about in a couple of our case studies where we go in and we evaluate. In some cases, we're heavily involved in that documentation, and other times we're purely the moderator or facilitator to get that process moving inside of that organization.
Thanks, James. And Hardy, earlier I referred to you as the nonprofit guru, in the most layman's terms, but tell us a little bit more. What does that mean when we call you the guru, and what other types of services and expertise do you have to offer that could benefit some of our listeners?
Zach, thank you, and audience participants, thank you so very much for being a part of the program today. As a speaker and consultant, I work with nonprofit organizations who want to create an ongoing culture of performance. And I do that either through speaking or strategic planning type activities and other consulting services such as volunteer recruitment, membership recruitment, strengthening nonprofit boards, and also motivational opportunities when those come up.
All right, well, thank you, Hardy, and thank you again so much for joining us here today. With that, we are complete. This is the end of today's webinar. If anyone does have any questions as a follow-up, all of the contact information for myself, James, and Hardy is available on the screen. We will also be sending out a copy of this presentation or information on how to download a copy, as well as an additional handout that summarizes some of the key points that you have heard James and Hardy talk about here today. We thank you all for joining, and have a great day.